Hello, and welcome to this discussion of the choices confronting the Biden administration in Afghanistan. I'm George Beebe, Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. It's been said that second marriages are the triumph of hope over experience. I would say that if that's the case, then the United States has probably had at least 5 marriages in Afghanistan, in the sense that our military engagement in that country has gone through many repeated cycles of hope and disappointment. The Biden administration is now facing an important decision. Last year, the United States signed an agreement with the Taliban, committing itself to a military withdrawal by May 1st of this year. The Biden administration is now reviewing its options. Many people are advising that the new president should back away from this agreement and to use the prospect of continuing US military involvement as leverage over the Taliban. Others say that it is long past time for this war to end. We have today a distinguished panel of experts to discuss what's at stake in Afghanistan. Milt Bearden is a distinguished non-resident fellow at the Center for the National Interest. Milt has had a star-spangled career at the Central Intelligence Agency, where he served as chief of station in numerous posts, including Pakistan, and headed the famous Soviet East European Division. Of most relevance to today's discussion, he ran the agency's covert support for the Afghan Mujahideen during the Soviet War. After the attacks of September 11th in 2001, Milt wrote an article for Foreign Affairs in which he cautioned the United States against biting off more than it could chew in what he called the graveyard of empires. Few articles have held up as well in retrospect as Milt's prescient warning. Cheryl Benard is the director of Arch International, an organization that protects cultural heritage sites in crisis zones. She is the author of numerous books and articles on Afghanistan from the perspectives of counterterrorism, societal issues, democracy, culture, and public health. And our third panelist is Paul Pillar, who is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University and a contributing editor to the National Interest. Paul is a former national intelligence officer for the Near East and South Asia. And his books include Terrorism and US Foreign Policy and Negotiating Peace, War Termination as a Bargaining Process. Our discussion today is going to start out with a short set of opening remarks by our panelists, followed by questions and answers from the audience. I'll begin with Milt Bearden. Milt, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that introduction, George, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this panel. One has to have a little bit of an understanding of the history of Afghanistan before we start looking at the options that President Biden has before him. Now, I don't need to go back to Alexander the Great in 327, 326 BC, where he found that his engagement in Afghanistan was the toughest single engagement he had, as he had gone through conquering Persia on his way along the Indus, where he promptly died after he exited Afghanistan. The Mughal emperors, all in their own ways, tried to go in and tame Afghanistan, finally giving up and moving on to more fertile ground in India. The more modern engagements with foreign armies involved the British 2.5 times in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And those engagements were probably the moment when you couldn't have a sentence with Afghanistan in it without the word betrayal or disaster in it as well. The retreat from Kabul in 1842 after a very easy entry a few years earlier, like they all are. Started off with about 16,000 plus British, Indian sepoy and cavalry, Indian followers, and others in a column heading for Jalalabad from Kabul. 16,000 took off in the winter, and Surgeon Major Brighton made it to Jalalabad himself. Other stragglers came in many years later and months later. The second great Afghan war resulted in one of the greatest British disasters at Maivan down in the south. Then the Soviets come in. And when the Soviets enter, you add a new word to the Afghan equation, and it's miscalculation. So betrayal, disaster, miscalculation. Leonid Brezhnev thought he knew Jimmy Carter and thought that Carter might not even notice if he went in late 79 and tidied up his problem in Afghanistan. It was beginning to spill over into the Soviet republics across the Oxus River. He thought America had still not recovered from being driven out of Southeast Asia with its tail between its legs. And so he could pop in and out, and Carter wouldn't either notice or do much about it. So on a snowy Christmas Eve in 1979, Brezhnev sent in the 105th Airborne and some Ministry of Interior troops, and another easy entry into Afghanistan. Carter did indeed notice. He did a couple of things. He canceled a few agreements with the Soviets on opening consulates in both our countries and some wheat deals. And then he made a very quiet finding and order to the CIA to start providing lethal aid to the Mujahideen in their struggle against the Soviet occupation, which CIA scrambled to do and began within a matter of weeks by delivering cases and cases of venerable old British 303 Enfield rifles. Carter handed over to Bill Casey and Ronald Reagan, and our involvement in the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan continued, but it was beginning to take on the flavor of fighting to the last Afghan. I think at some point, at about midpoint in the Soviet occupation, Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey decided, let's do something maybe even more moral in their view of the world, and let's see if we can win. And so we upped the ante, gave air defense capabilities to the Mujahideen, and went up from a few $100 million to around $1 billion a year, 1 billion a year. That's like a week today in Afghanistan for American troops. And so beginning in 1986, the worm really turned on the Soviets. By 1988, after Brezhnev had long gone and a series of Soviet general secretaries had come and gone as well, and Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev had taken over, the first who had not put his signature on the order to dispatch Soviet troops to Afghanistan back in '79, decided he would give his army one more year to stanch this bleeding wound or get out. And in April of 1988, in Geneva, they agreed to exit Afghanistan, to do it in 9 months, and they stuck to their word and were gone on February 15th, 1989. That set in motion another piece of the graveyard of empires, because throughout the summer, first in Hungary, then in Poland, then in East Germany, and by November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall was breached, and it was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Empire. Then we come to moving into the US involvement in this thing. After the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia, the US and Saudi Arabia took a common position on Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden had taken credit for the Somalia incident, although I'm not sure we know what he really did there. But he was at this time in exile in Sudan, and word was taken to the Sudanese, and I'm very well aware of that process, to say, you got to get rid of Osama bin Laden. To which the Sudanese came back and said, okay, we'll send him to Saudi Arabia, to which the Saudis said, no way, we do not want him as some sort of a North Star. Okay, we'll give him to you Americans. And we said we couldn't really pin him with Somalia, so we don't want that. The Sudanese came back to the Americans and said, how about Afghanistan? And the position at that time was, couldn't be any farther away, perfect. So bin Laden is off to Afghanistan, and the rest of the story begins to flow from there. Now, the events of 9/11 forced this country into doing something. We had to do something. But I'm not sure that there weren't huge miscalculations at that time as well on just how much we should have done with both Afghanistan and the military action we took there. The Taliban at that time had understood that we were getting serious about an invasion. They got the word to me that perhaps I should give somebody a call close to Mullah Omar, which I did. And he gave me a message. He said, you must know the following. That man is no longer under our protection. And then he repeated that. Now, within the Pashtun culture, by saying he's no longer under our protection, the message was very clear to me that you know everything, you know where he is, you've got probably a satellite assigned to him, just go get him, we'll look the other way. The government at that time did not want to take that position. It was, I think, absolutely committed to going into Afghanistan. So that possible miscalculation has led us, I think, to where we are now looking at a 20-year war, perhaps the longest, or 21-year wars, or whatever, however you'd like to characterize it. So we have reached this point now where I will break it off, is that we have to either say that the United States can stick with commitments of a previous administration or not. If we get out completely, there will be consequences that no American will, in good time, be happy with, whether an official or just a citizen. So this is a tremendously difficult decision. The easiest thing to do would be to hang in there, but that's not the easiest choice at this time. So we are at a moment for the Biden administration where its decision will be among the most important foreign policy decisions I think it will make, at least in its first term, and determine if there is a second one. So let me leave it at that, George, and open it up to others.
Thank you, Milt. I'll just interject a little bit of history that I had a tangential role in. After 9/11, I was heading up Russian foreign policy analysis at the agency, and I was asked to go back and talk to people at the agency who had worked the Soviet Afghan problem and get their advice on how we should move forward here. And so I did that, and the one bottom line judgment that was common to everyone that I talked to on that was, don't try to impose a strong central government on Afghanistan. It has never been run through a strong central government, can't be run through a strong central government. So whatever you do, don't focus on trying to build centralization in Afghanistan. My read of what happened subsequently was that was one piece of advice that was not heeded. Let's turn now to Cheryl. Cheryl, your thoughts.
Okay, so the question before us is, what should the Biden administration do about Afghanistan? On a similar challenge, the health issue, their mantra has been listen to the scientists. And I believe that on the issue of Afghanistan, the mantra should be guided by the facts. There are many, many discussions in op-eds, in lectures, in panel discussions such as this one over the past few months on that very issue. But I noticed that most of them come from a place of moral expectations and hopes and descriptions of what outcome we wish we could achieve there. And that's fine, but you can't base policy on that. Policy has to be based on ground realities. So some are arguing that we should remain in Afghanistan longer. We should extend our presence there. And on the basis of facts, I think such a decision would make sense if one or more of the following were true. One, if the military situation were moving in our favor, it would make sense to stay longer. If there was some military adjustment or some adjustment to our military strategy that we could make that we haven't tried yet, it would make sense to try that. If the Afghan military was on the verge of self-reliance, and if we just stayed a little while longer, they could handle the conflict on their own, again, it would make sense to prolong our presence there. And then moving aside from the military, if the trajectory on things that we care about socially, like greater equality, women's education, health, education in general, economic development, if the trajectory on those things were upward moving, then again, it would make sense to just give it more of a push and get it beyond some hypothetical tipping point where it could be sustainable once we left. If any of those things were true, and if several of them were true, definitely, then we ought to stay there longer. So let's look at some of the facts and see if we think that they are true. Spoiler alert, they're not. So I'm going to start with the New York Times article from 2019 that asked the question, what did the US get for $2 trillion in Afghanistan? That's the title. And the answer was not very much. 1.5 trillion went, and this is 2019, so it's more since then, a lot more. 1.5 trillion went to the direct military waging of war expenses. And that ended with the Taliban controlling or able to contest more than half of the country. The latest estimates now, I just looked it up again today, take it closer to quite shocking 70%. But let's say it's 50%. That's not exactly a success story in terms of our military. As those of you who follow these matters will recall, we've tried, I formerly, before my life in cultural heritage, I was an analyst with the National Security Research Division at the RAND Corporation. And so I have followed for a very long time our various military strategies, and I don't think a stone was left unturned, because every new general that came in thought that this was his challenge that he was going to master, and they tried something new. You will recall that we tried 2 military surges, and none of that turned this situation around. $87 billion went for training of the Afghan police and military. The problems of corruption being that there were large numbers of imaginary soldiers, they were called ghost soldiers in the terminology there, who were collecting wages but didn't actually exist, and the money went into the pockets of whoever was doing that imaginary recruitment. The retention rates were an enormous problem, and those two together were so bad that every year you had to replace 1/3 or restock 1/3 of the Afghan military. So that is a that is a figure that is alarming. And if we pause there for a moment, so we and the Europeans have been training for well over 10 years, the Afghan military and the Afghan police. And yet I don't think anyone could say that the Afghans need any help or any training if they want to fight, because look at the Taliban. They don't have NATO or the US training them. They're doing better than sorry, but frankly, they're doing better than the troops that we're training. And they don't have billions of dollars either. Unlike Al-Qaeda, they don't have massive Saudi money coming in. So they're doing this for other reasons. When your adversary with no resources is doing much better than you are with massive resources, then something is clearly awry. We spent $30 billion on reconstruction projects. That's schools, clinics, hospitals, roads, things like that. I'll never forget the moment when I was at the Rand Corporation when I read my first CIGAR report. CIGAR is the United States government accounting office, especially dedicated to looking at the expenditures in Afghanistan. I've never read anything so devastating. Actually at that moment, I didn't understand how this whole reconstruction thing could even continue going forward. What they found in their studies, and they've repeated them since then, is that not only did no one on the spending side know what the status of these projects was, there hadn't been quality control. They went and looked, some of the clinics and hospitals that were being recorded as completed hadn't even leveled the ground yet for the construction. And for a considerable number of them, no one could even tell CIGAR where these projects were supposed to be. It was just a colossal bit of mismanagement, and goes far to explain why the results have been so much less than stellar. So let's look at now, finally, in conclusion, what is the trajectory on some of the things that we care about the most, and some of the reasons that we feel why we shouldn't leave. And that is progress for women, progress for education, progress for social justice. So what's the trajectory? On the economy, this is currently what you could call a completely subsidized country. It isn't able, they don't pay any of their salaries for anything. They don't pay for any of their own institutions. Everything is subsidized from donors and from donor countries from the outside. And it's not surprising, because the aspects of their economy that are the most promising, and this really could be a very productive, and one could even say wealthy country. It's a country with a tradition of agriculture, but you can't do farming when you have conflict and war everywhere. It's a country with huge mining reserves. Again, you can't do the mining when there is insecurity. So none of this is going to change if there isn't stability. And there isn't stability unless there is some sort of an arrangement with an adversary that we haven't been able to defeat militarily. The world, I'm going to quote briefly from some sources that are, in my view, relatively unimpeachable and that don't really have an agenda here, or have only a positive agenda. So the World Bank, according to the World Bank, with all of this investment in education, barely half of young Afghans are literate at present. Almost half of all Afghans between 15 and 24 are neither in school, nor are they working, nor are they in some sort of a training program. The attendance of girls in school has declined steeply since 2013, again, largely because of security reasons. More than 70% of Afghans have no access at all to electricity. According to UNAMA, only 27% have access to safe drinking water, which is a big cause for the ongoing significant mortality rates for children. According to UNICEF and to Doctors Without Borders, Afghanistan remains, along with Somalia and Chad, one of the three countries with the highest maternal mortality rates. And again, this is after all of our years of building clinics, training midwives, and so on. But if the women can't go to the clinics because there's no security, and the midwives can't go to the rural areas, then that isn't going to work. The average level of maternal mortality is between 800 and 1,200 maternal deaths for every 100,000 live births, which is staggeringly high and very sad. Education. I think we've all gone to these events about Afghanistan and what should we do? And initially somebody will always say, we can't stop now. We've made such amazing progress. You know, the girls are all in school again. 3.5 million girls are in class. I don't know where those numbers come from. According to Human Rights Watch and Save the Children, which I think are two very reliable sources, girls' education is in decline. According to Human Rights Watch, quote, 16 years after the US-led military intervention, this is their 2017 report, 2/3 of girls do not go to school. According to Save the Children, half of school buildings are not in use or have been taken over by an armed group or the Afghan military or international forces because there aren't any classes taking place there. So this is all quite discouraging and certainly nothing that one thinks about with pleasure. I personally have respect and affection, one could say, for President Ghani Ashraf, who was my classmate at AUB and who I think is an extremely decent, dedicated person, but simply is on mission impossible. And I think that when we talk about what's going to happen to the women now if we leave, well, which women? The women in Kabul, one needs to think about how one can build into the negotiations securities for them. And we need to think, how can Ashraf be encouraged to negotiate some red lines very clearly and safeguard what they've achieved? But we have to remember that the vast majority of Afghan women are very far from dreaming of a college career. They're dreaming of having a baby without dying in the process. And they're dreaming of having children that they can give water to that aren't going to make them sick. And none of that's going to happen as long as this war continues. And my concluding thought would be that it's not really a choice between keeping the war going and doing nothing. There's a range of other tools that one has in diplomacy and in politics. And I think we should be focusing on those.
Thank you, Cheryl. I'd like to come back to that last point that you made once we get into the question and answer on what else could we do in between those extremes of complete withdrawal and doing nothing. Paul, floor is yours.
Thank you, George, and thank you for the invitation to participate with Cheryl and Milt in this forum. You know, when a foreign expedition has gone on as long as the US one in Afghanistan has, it's easy to lose sight of what was the original purpose. And it was 20 years ago to respond to a terrorist attack. As Milt said, we had to do something, and something rather forceful. You know, one could say that that mission was accomplished in the first few months after Operation Enduring Freedom, when we succeeded in rousting Al-Qaeda from its residence in Afghanistan and ousting its ally, the Taliban, from its role as the de facto government over most of Afghanistan. But we didn't take that exit ramp, and here we are 20 years later. Basically, everything else that has been stated in the subsequent 2 decades as a mission in Afghanistan is in essence mission creep. The stark fact is it would be hard to make a persuasive case that the internal Afghan political, economic, and social makeup of the country really adds up to a vital US interest, or an interest important enough to make the kind of sacrifices and expenditures that we have over the last 20 years. There is a tendency, given the trauma of 9/11 and the whole Al-Qaeda episode, to think of Afghanistan as having a special place in international terrorism. And indeed, the Afghanistan study group, the congressionally mandated group that issued a report last month, tries to make a case along those lines. But if we're looking not just at history, but at actual terrorist dangers now and in the future, that really doesn't add up. Afghanistan is not unique among all the places on the globe that international terrorist groups, be it Al-Qaeda or someone else, could take up residence. And besides, you know, having a physical safe haven or residence like that is not even necessarily the most important thing to determine the extent of terrorist threats to Americans in the years ahead. If you look at 9/11 itself, most of the preparation of which took place not in Afghanistan, but in places like Hamburg and Spain, and US flight schools, and most importantly in cyberspace. The underlying political dynamic in the United States here has been, over those 20 years, a reluctance on the part of any US administration to pull the plug on the Afghanistan endeavor, lest that it be followed by the occurrence of some violent incident, some terrorist attack that had some connection to Afghanistan, and then the administration that did the pullout would be taking the political heat for it. And in addition to all that, there's the common psychological tendency to treat sunk costs as investments, something that we have to sustain until we get somehow a positive return. And we get hints of that in a lot of the rhetoric. Some of it came up in the Afghanistan study group report that I mentioned. If one talks about sustaining the current US military presence of 2,500 or even increasing it a bit, and the Afghan study group report mentions the figure of 4,500, you really have to ask, how much could such a presence accomplish that has not been accomplished in the last 20 years, in which the US troop presence peaked at nearly 100,000 back in 2010 and 2011. I think Cheryl has covered pretty thoroughly the fact that the trends are not favorable, whether you're talking about the military situation and the level of enemy activity or several of the other measures that are pertinent. So exit is in order. And a responsible way to accomplish an exit ought to reflect a couple of the realities that I think are reflected in Secretary Blinken's letter to President Ghani that made its way into the press during the past week. And one of those realities is that US interests are simply not to be equated with the interests of the Ghani government. That letter had a tone of tough love to it, I think appropriately enough. Among other things, it held out the prospect that May 1st deadline for a total withdrawal, according to the terms of the US Taliban agreement in February of last year, is still very much on the table as far as US options are concerned. The other very important reality is that there are other players, other countries that have at least as much reason as the United States to be concerned about and to be involved with the future of Afghanistan. And in this respect, we can note that Secretary Blinken's letter stated that the US would be asking the United Nations to convene a meeting that would include not just the United States, but also Russia, China, Pakistan, Iran, and India to discuss the future of Afghanistan. Such a confab could evolve into something that would be, in essence, a second version of the Bonn Conference back 19 and 20 years ago that led to the government that would be led by Hamid Karzai. Only in this case, the Taliban would be involved as a player. Each of those other countries involved that were on that list do have reasons to be concerned about extremist violence in Afghanistan or the instability of the whole country, in many cases for reasons that are much more direct than the United States has. And I would note that Russia is moving in this same direction. Just 2 days ago, Moscow announced that it would be sending out invitations for a meeting to be held a week from today to include the United States and China and Pakistan, and also Qatar, which has been hosting the existing bilateral talks between the Taliban and the Ghani government. And so that could be something that might evolve into a Bond 2 type arrangement. Now, if the United States were to go one of these routes, a sort of multilateral diplomatic detour that held in abeyance for the moment the total withdrawal of troops going past that May 1st deadline, this would be a risky thing. The biggest risk here, I think, is that the Taliban might react with rejection and start attacking US personnel again, which if they did would bring to an end a streak that we have going now for over 12 months of no US combat fatalities in Afghanistan, even though we still have the 2,500 troops there. Certainly you would need Taliban buy-in into one of these multilateral diplomatic formulas if it involved setting aside the May 1st deadline. Now, there are plenty of reasons to doubt that the Taliban would necessarily go along with that. As the old cliche goes, you know, we have the watches, they have the time, and the specter is they would just outwait us and keep fighting. But as Barney Rubin has pointed out, for the Taliban, they've got other incentives too. And one of which is it would be of value to them not to be a pariah, but instead to be part of a new Afghan political order that would have international blessing. So I don't think we should rule out of hand that the Taliban would be open to the kind of sort of extension plus an extended multilateral diplomatic framework that I'm talking about. Let me close with a couple of thoughts about the concerns that have repeatedly been expressed about what Afghanistan would be like if the Taliban, either completely or as a partner or as a portion of a new political order, had substantial influence in a new Afghanistan. If we're concerned about the welfare of ordinary Afghan people, that you always have to consider the alternative, which is more war, which has hurt the Afghan civilian population at least as much as anything. According to the UN statistics, for the last several years, basically since about 2014, each year civilian casualties have stayed at the rate of around 3,500 killed and about 7,000 injured each year. The subject of the status of women comes up. Cheryl alluded to that. And as for that, you'd have to again ask the question, what's worse for Afghan women? Life under some new political order in which the Taliban might have a role, or a continuation of the current warfare. And that is something that SIGAR, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction that Cheryl alluded to, addressed in a report that they issued just yesterday. And I'd like to quote from that. A long-term danger for Afghan women is that Afghan peace negotiations break down, plunging the country into worse violence. Physical insecurity remains one of the biggest challenges facing women, both directly and indirectly. Women and girls suffer not only loss of life, injury, disability, and mental trauma, but also the loss of male breadwinners, increasingly desperate poverty, the social stigma and discrimination that accompany widowhood and permanent disability and reduced access to basic services, unquote. That's the specter of continued warfare. Finally, as a last point, to return back to that original purpose of counterterrorism, the Taliban are not an international terrorist group. They do not have an interest in international terrorism. The worst setback that they ever suffered was in response to what Osama bin Laden did back in 2001, which brought the wrath of an angry United States down on them and resulted in loss of their position as the de facto government over most of Afghanistan. Back in 2001, the Taliban had a relationship with Al-Qaeda because bin Laden and Al-Qaeda were assisting them in very real material ways in an ongoing civil war against what was then called the Northern Alliance. That's pretty much the kind of situation that exists today. And the best way to discourage Taliban alliances with the likes of Al-Qaeda is not to seek a military solution that is still out of reach and the trends keep it out of reach, but rather to look at ways to end the civil war in Afghanistan and end the incentive for the Taliban to do business with the likes of Al-Qaeda. With that, back to you, George.
Great, thank you, Paul. You've done a good job of exploring some of those in-between options that Cheryl alluded to, but we're getting several questions in from the audience that are related to this. So I want to pose this to Cheryl and to Milt. What could we do short of warfare, short of military, direct military engagement in Afghanistan that can help secure our interests in Afghanistan, help strengthen stability in Afghanistan? What do those in-between options look like? Cheryl, you want to start out?
Yeah. So, well, as I mentioned briefly, and as I've said to many of my Afghan feminist friends, if I were them, I would be concentrating very hard on defining what are my red lines. What do I go into those negotiations knowing that I want to achieve. And I'm not seeing that that's happening sufficiently. So maybe that's something we could help them do, is help them figure out their negotiating posture and what it is that they want to achieve and how they want to argue for that too. So, you know, what will be their reasoning for that, and how do they best make their case? Secondly, you know, as Paul said, the first time we went after the Taliban, we didn't have thousands or tens of thousands of US troops on the ground there. It doesn't need that, and they know that. If they cross our line, and if they don't stick to their bargains, we also have kinetic means to go against them, and they're aware of that. I also do believe they say, and can you believe everything the Taliban says? No, you can't believe anything that anybody says, but you should take it on board and you should reflect on it. So one of the things that the Taliban do say is that they want to make a success of their country. They don't want to be impoverished with no chance to improve their standard of living for their people, and they don't want to be an outcast pariah state. And they understand that if they don't respect some of the rules and expectations of the international community, they won't get money from the international community. No one will do business with them, and they will be once again marginalized. So I think that is something to build on as well. And I would probably try to start pulling them into relationships that can be constructive in that regard, help them start thinking about what economic development would look like, help them start having a vision for what that sort of a future society could look like.
Milt, let me pose this same question to you in a little bit different way. You have an article in the new edition of the National Interest that looks at the question of what you call aftercare in situations where the United States has been involved militarily and has with set of local partners to whom we have at least some degree of moral and practical obligation. I remember former Secretary of State Colin Powell used to say, you know, if you break it, you bought it. We've definitely played a role in breaking Afghanistan. To what degree do we have an obligation after a military withdrawal to help make that situation a little more manageable, a little less disorderly?
Well, this is always the good question. And yes, aftercare is always an issue, and we don't do it well. Never mind Vietnam. We've discussed that in the same article. But the first moment where aftercare in Afghanistan came to the forefront for American policy was in February 1989, when Boris Gromov, the commander of Soviet 40th Army, marched across the Oxus. Now, we had some ongoing efforts of US aid and others trying to help Afghanistan in a post-Soviet occupation period, but that didn't last long. It didn't last long because Washington itself, I think, lost interest, and Washington lost interest because of that absolutely stunning year of 1989, which began the ultimate collapse of the USSR. And the focus of the H.W. Bush administration was on that, like a laser, trying to do the right thing, trying to reunite East and West Germany inside NATO, which along with Helmut Kohl, they were able to do. So we walked away from Afghanistan. I use that rather harsh term, but it's the truth. We're at another point now. Now, over the last 20 years, you know, the Taliban have grown in a number of ways. I mean, they all like iPhones more than Android phones. I had a long session with the Taliban in Kabul, not all that long ago, who said, you know, you Americans, you're not really bad folks when you're not shooting at us, but here's your fatal flaw. You spend huge amounts of energy and resources to define your enemy, and then you fight that definition, and then you wonder why you don't win. And the truth is, I think we don't have a clue of what the Taliban is or will be or can be. But within the Taliban world, there are people who would be quite possibly well-functioning ministers of mines and minerals. The Taliban are absolutely aware of what the mineral resources of Afghanistan are. They are in artisanal manners. They're exploiting it here and there, a little bit of chromite here, a little bit of gold there, but they understand and would welcome that the Americans actually might come back in that role at some point and in that manner, maybe help Afghanistan move towards being something like a middle-class country in some years hence. I think those discussions can begin. And it will begin with us understanding who are the Taliban today. You know, yeah, they actually have four fingers and an opposing thumb. This is, you know, don't listen to all of the nonsense. And I think we're going to have to deal with it. The question has been raised, does the Taliban have a role, or will the Taliban have a role in the new government, the new Afghanistan? I think for the last 20 years, it's had a pretty big role to tie us up to the tune of $2 trillion. So any effort to do anything in Afghanistan without having serious adult discussions with these people we call the Taliban, and that's probably part of the problem because we have defined what that is, will have to include a lot of the things that American industry, American mining corporations, Canadians, Australians are more than willing to get into if there's a little bit of security attached to it. And I don't know how that, if that gets into the question entirely, but it puts some different light on a facet or two.
If I could add to the aftercare question briefly, I think we also need to reflect on our own attitude. This is not some desperate wasteland with no resources and no people who are capable of achieving anything. This is a place that's had multiple great civilizations. They built, you know, amazing structures without our help. These are the people who built the Bamiyan Buddhas. They didn't have, you know, the Army Corps of Engineers there telling them how to do it. They were a center of farming and agriculture, and they have incredible high quality fruits that they produce, again, without our help. They were in the early mining history. Archaeologists are most interested in them because that is where, in prehistoric times, they invented certain technologies that then spread to other parts of the world. These are people who can accomplish things. We've been in their way. We've created a culture of corruption there. We've created a huge culture of dependency. I believe that one of the best things we can do is get out of their way and let them develop their own society again and their own economy.
We have a question from David Abramson, who is an analyst of Russian-Asian relations at the US Department of State. He asks, how do you view a US openness to Russian participation in stabilization talks in the context of its impact on broader global risks to US-Russian relations? Does it weaken US efforts to counter Russian challenges or threats if we're open to their involvement on Afghan stabilization? Paul, can you start on that?
I don't see any reason why it would weaken it. If there are areas in which the Russians, as well as we, and as I suggested in my earlier comments, probably the Russians at least as much as we, have an interest in addressing, and let them do some of the diplomatic heavy lifting, I simply don't see, either logically or as a matter of past history, how that would impede any way in which we want or need to stand up to the Russians in other areas where our interests may collide.
I agree. I don't see a conflict of interest between us and them there. And furthermore, to be pragmatic, you know, if you're worried about your adversary, keeping him busy doing something that's in your best interest too seems like a good thing.
Well, I don't think it's a zero-sum game with the Russians on this either. Until the adjustment of the Central Asian states and their allegiances. The Russians have a real involvement there. And of course, I think they should be part of any future discussions. And they did the earliest work on mapping out the mineral resources of Afghanistan. Of course, they're going to be involved, and they can be involved constructively. I mean, we can manage Vladimir Vladimirovich in other areas as nasty as we'd like to, but then this one is one where we have both made grotesque miscalculations in the last 50 years.
I would add that we can say similar things about China. And of course, for China, their first thought when they look at Afghanistan, they think about the likes of the Taliban or its relationship with Al-Qaeda is, any possible connections to or stimulus of activism among Islamist groups in Xinjiang and among their minorities. But again, they have at least as much a reason, a good reason to be involved and make a constructive contribution to the diplomacy for a more stable and less radical Afghanistan.
And if you don't let someone participate, then their alternative is to be a spoiler. And that's the last thing we want there as well.
A question from Trevor Filseth from the Gulf International Forum that I'm going to direct to Cheryl. He asks, how reliable, in your view, are negotiations with the Taliban? If we make a final agreement with them, are they likely to keep it after we've left?
So again, we have to make sure that we think about what are the consequences we can impose if they don't, and if they don't, to what extent. And we have to evaluate, do we trust their posture? Does it seem to make sense logically what they're promising and what they're saying? Actually, in that regard, I worry a little bit about not meeting the deadline for the withdrawal that we've agreed upon with them, because we're kind of setting a bad precedent then to them. We're telling them that we're not going to honor our agreements. So they could reasonably say, well, then why should we, if that's your new rule, that these things can be broken. I would be nervous about doing that. I would like to see if there's a different way around that, frankly.
I think if we are talking to the Taliban seriously, we and they could move that 1 May date a little bit, and that they could possibly agree with that. I do agree with Cheryl, though, that they have every reason to believe that we can't be trusted, as much as the questioner asking if we can trust them. There isn't a lot of mutual trust on this thing. That's going to have to be built now. But I think if there are sweeteners put into the thing, and if we do indeed understand that the Taliban have goals and dreams or hopes, or however you'd like to call it, for Afghanistan, then we could play a role in that as well.
And the fact that was mentioned earlier that, in fact, no American has been killed in conflict with the Taliban for an entire year is some evidence that one can trust them to keep to their agreements when they want to.
And I would underscore something else Cheryl referred to, which was we do have, aerial ways of projecting power. And, that's related to part of Milt's history when he recalled how when we had bin Laden in our sights, before 9/11, we had a chance to do something about it. But we didn't have the political backing for the administration of the day, first the Clinton administration, and then the first 8 months of the Bush administration, to conduct warfare in this faraway place until we did have the tragedy of 9/11. Then the gloves came off. Then you had the political basis for acting forcefully. And that condition really has continued in a way that I think the Taliban is well aware of.
Question from James Pindell of the Boston Globe. He asked, what is the actual deadline for a Biden decision? He obviously can't decide to remove troops on April 30th and have 2,500 of them gone by the next day. So what's the real deadline? Next week, end of the month? When?
I think it actually is May 1st or April 30th, because if we commence with the serious removal, then I think that technically we'll be within the agreement.
Right.
You can see America can when it wants to, it can do that fast. I mean, it's going to leave a lot of untidiness behind, but if it's 2,500 troops plus getting our allies, the allied nations out along with us, that's not too many C-17s or too much of an airlift out of Kabul and elsewhere in Afghanistan. I think we could do it very fast, if that's what we end up doing.
A question from Evan Sankey from the Center for the National Interest. He asks, how might a US withdrawal affect our strengthening relationship with India? Paul, would you like to tackle that?
Well, I think it has to be part of that multilateral diplomacy and expanded thinking along those lines that I referred to earlier, and that India, indeed, as I mentioned, is one of the players that was specifically cited in Secretary Blinken's letter. There's no question that the Indian-Pakistani rivalry has always been one of the complications in dealing with Afghanistan. The Pakistanis getting extremely uptight anytime a new Indian consulate has opened somewhere, and the Indians seeing the flip side of that. So I would look for full Indian involvement as another one of those players that has a legitimate interest, but also can be perhaps not as direct a way as Pakistan can be a spoiler if they're left out.
A related question from Daniel Esser of American University. He says, the panelists have thus far focused on stakeholders who share an interest in a stable Afghanistan. Could they also please comment on the motivations of those who are working to keep the country unstable and the US options for dealing with this?
Well, I think there isn't some player I can think of who has a preset agenda, grounded in fundamental interests that sees an unstable Afghanistan as part of a grand strategy. I think destabilization, to the extent it occurs at the hands of either the Pakistanis or the Iranians or someone else, would be a response to their perception that their interests are not being taken into account by others who are acting on the Afghan problem. The Pakistanis, by virtue of the relationship that they have had with the Taliban in past years, have already demonstrated that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean that there is a lasting interest in Islamabad as a Pakistani national interest to forever have an unstable Afghanistan on the other side of the Durand line. And that's certainly not true with the Iranians, and I don't think it's true of any of the other players we've mentioned.
I think, and this is I was saying we should look at the facts. This is a sad fact, but it's nonetheless one that we can't be naive about. There are vested interests that benefit from a continuation of the status quo and a continuation of the conflict. And those vested interests include large US Beltway bandit, contractor companies, I'm sorry to say, whose economy is fueled by the ongoing conflict. And we have to be aware of that, and we can't let that influence our policy. That would be very irresponsible.
Can I add to that there are people in Afghanistan who are the recipients of American largesse who also have a vested interest in it continuing? Well,
for sure.
And we might also add the point that to the extent that Afghanistan is seen as a continued quagmire for the United States, then that provides a tempting target for anyone who wants to keep us bogged down because they see us being distracted and expending resources as being in their interest. Mm-hmm. After all, we once had that kind of attitude toward the Soviets, didn't we?
Yeah.
Well, that's the way it started with us, actually, is let them be bogged down in Afghanistan. That's just fine. I don't think that was Carter's motivation. Of all of the presidents involved in the Afghan drama on the American side, he was probably the one, and I use this word carefully, who had better moral credentials But indeed, it looked in the first half of the 10-year Soviet occupation that it was just, bleed them dry, fight to the last Afghan. And then I do think the policy changed, or at least that's the way that President Reagan and Bill Casey presented it to me when I was tasked to go out there. And the measures were taken to bring it to a conclusion. That's possibly because the Soviets were beginning to show greater vulnerabilities across the board, and it was something one could actually think about, is bringing them down, with Sheikh Yamani on the oil side and the Polish Pope, and Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and a few things like this. So all of that is the history. But now, if it becomes unstable again, Pakistan is, it's got a thing called the Durand Line. The Afghans don't recognize it as a border. It's a zero line to Afghans. And, 2.5 million Afghans came in during the Soviet time, and another couple of million over into Iran. So, I don't know how that would play today if there was a big refugee, migrant surge into Afghanistan or Pakistan from Afghanistan.
We're nearing the end of our time here. I want to wrap up with a final question. It comes from Roseanne Rodriguez, who asks, do you see any societal impact in the United States from the constant military engagement of the last few decades? And I'm going to add to this because we have the author of Afghanistan, The Graveyard of Empires with us today. Is the US engagement in Afghanistan and the failure to bring that war to a triumphal conclusion something that does pose a threat to the US role in the world, its predominance in international affairs? Thoughts on this?
Well, I think there were two questions there. At least I heard another part of one, is how accustomed has the great American folk become to this war? I think it's been very accustomed to it because it doesn't really touch them. The number of Americans, since there was no more draft, military service barely touches the great American folk. It's the same families in the same counties in the same states that give up their sons and daughters for this military service, and it's not a group that one has to cater to any extent. So I think that hasn't had a domestic effect in this country. I could be argued against on that, but I don't think that has amounted to much. As far as what do we look like moving forward? I mean, does ridding ourselves of this $2 trillion adventure allow us to do something in the world that we couldn't or haven't done? I'm not sure of that. I don't think that anybody else has stepped up yet, although we are looking at the rising China and the whole Thucydides trap, et cetera. And that may consume us a little bit as we move forward, and I don't think it'll be Afghanistan.
I'm actually optimistic that this could have a very positive effect, because we've been sort of trapped a little bit in this notion that we can go somewhere with the military and then afterwards we fix that society through social engineering, and then it comes out of it, in a fantastic, new, beautiful condition. And that's a very unrealistic and a very arrogant posture. I mean, look at our own society. We had quite a bit of upheaval this last year on issues such as racial injustice. I feel we're going to come out of it in a much better place with stronger values. But would we have liked some other country to come intervene and tell us, that this is, we're racist and we're this or that and they're going to fix us? I don't think that would have been very promising. And on all the issues that we care about, women's rights, social justice, minority rights, these are things that societies must fix for themselves. And I think that understanding that is going to help us avoid a lot of other adventures in the future, and it will be better for those societies too. My only fear, if I can add that quickly, is my fear, and this is something we might think about, is that the upper middle class, the educated urban elite of Afghanistan will panic and will sort of instantly remove itself to asylum in other countries. And if they don't stay and hold the line, then modernity there and the advances there really will be in jeopardy. That would be a shame. And so I think we ought to think about how can we help them transition from a donor-driven economy to an actual economy with substance. There are businesses there working on all sorts of various products and issues. If we could help them sort of bring that to market and start having a realistic and substantive economy that they can believe in, that will give them the sense that they can exist there and that their livelihoods can continue, even if they're not getting subsidies from USAID and others anymore, that would help a lot.
Consistent with some of what Cheryl just said, I think the prosecution of the forever wars, with Afghanistan being the centerpiece of that, has helped to sustain an attitude of American exceptionalism that has not, on balance, in my view, been constructive in the way we address our own problems. I think if we get away from that pattern, we will be more sensitive to use the words of the Declaration of Independence, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, and see how many of our own problems, whether it comes to voting rights or economic inequality, aren't all that different from what have arisen in other countries of the world. And we can't just either ignore them on the one hand or do away with them through military force. So I think that there will be a constructive effect on our attitudes back here in the United States dealing with our problems, to the extent that we can get away from the forever wars.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've come full circle now from beginning with the triumph of hope over experience to the hope that we can learn from experience and build a better, more effective foreign policy future. Thank you to all of our panelists. I think this has been an excellent discussion, and I look forward to seeing you all next time we get into our follow-on discussions on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
I